Yay, Jenny, you remembered.
No, no, it wasn't me who remembered. It was Brianna.
Oh, Brianna, thank you.
But yay, Jenny, you are here and we can record with your
Yeah.
permission.
Ah, we did it. We did it. I think you can start, Julie.
Okay, great. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the third annual Work in Progress series by the One Health at Penn research community. The series is organized by the One Health in Action group, led by faculty from Penn Vet and Penn Medicine, with support from a grant provided by the Penn Environmental Innovations Initiative. I would like to extend a special thanks to Dr. Jenny Punt, the Associate Dean for One Health at Penn Vet, for her visionary and inspiring leadership. And I also want to acknowledge Dr. Hilary Nelson, the Director of the Masters in Public Health program, our wonderful partner at Penn Medicine, and the Associate Director of the One Health in Action faculty group.
Huh?
We need it.
I have no idea.
No, you're not.
Oh, sorry.
The Work in Progress series brings together experts, scholars, and enthusiasts to share knowledge across various disciplines, showcasing the remarkable research within this wonderful academic community and fostering innovative connections and collaborations across Penn's 12 schools. For those who are not familiar with the term One Health, it refers to the understanding that the health of the environment, humans, plants, and animals is interconnected. One Health also serves as a problem-solving framework that emphasizes the importance of multidisciplinary collaboration in addressing the complex challenges we encounter in a rapidly changing environment. The focus of this year's series is on the role of animals and environmental and human health. It began with the question posed by Dr. Punt, what would life be without animals? From the pollinators that sustain our crops and food supply to the pets that enrich our well-being, animals shape our lives in countless ways, making this a universally relevant topic. Today's format includes two speakers, each presenting for 15 minutes, followed by an extended Q&A session. Please feel free to submit your questions in the chat. We will monitor it and help facilitate the discussion. In the final few minutes, I'll pose a question to the speakers about the possibilities and challenges of interdisciplinary collaboration. And without further ado, we are thrilled to welcome today's distinguished speakers whose theme is animals and emergency preparedness. Dr. Cindy Otto, Professor of Working Dog Sciences and Director of the Working Dog Center at Penn Vet, will present on lessons from 9/11, the intersection of canine and human health. And Dr. Lisa Murphy, Professor of Toxicology and Director of the Wildlife Futures Program at Penn Vet, will present animals, disasters, and the environment. We are thrilled to have Cindy and Lisa join us today.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks for having us here. It's interesting when I think about this, the dogs of 9/11, I look back and it's actually been 25 years this year since 9/11. And so many of the people in the audience may not have actually even been born when this event happened. But this has been an incredibly influential event for the country, for just how we look at things, but also for my career. And just this week, we received information that we had, I think, maybe our 15th or 16th publication from this data set accepted for publication. So just want to share with you a little bit about what we've learned from the dogs at 9/11. This was a prospective double cohort study, and it was really inspired by the work that I did on site with these dogs. And what we wanted to do was follow the dogs to see if there were any kind of long-term effects of working at 9/11. And in order to tell if there were effects of working at 9/11 versus just the impact of being a search and rescue dog or training in search and rescue, we had this study as a double cohort study, which meant we were following two groups of dogs, the deployed or dogs that were exposed to 9/11, and that included 95 dogs that were deployed either to the World Trade Center at Ground Zero, the Pentagon, or the Fresh Kills landfill, where the human remains dogs were working to identify human remains that had been recovered from Ground Zero. The control dogs were unexposed dogs. These are 55 non-deployed search and rescue dogs. And the details of both of these populations can be found in many of our publications. They were fairly similar, except the dogs that did deploy to the World Trade Center had a tendency to be a little bit more advanced in their skill set, and also an average age of about 5, whereas our control dogs, we had a little bit of an older group and a little bit of a younger group, as would make sense if people were choosing which dogs that they would take to an event like this. They would probably take their sort of top of the line dog. What we did during the study is we worked with veterinarians across the country, because these dogs actually represented everyone across the country coming to New York or to DC to respond. And so people went to their local veterinarian to have an evaluation. At that point, their veterinarian collected a complete blood count, chemistry profile. They obtained chest x-rays, and the handlers completed medical and behavioral surveys. And in the first year, we also did a toxicology screen looking for any kind of toxins. I think one of the things before we get into the medical point is that really the impact of the human-animal bond kind of played out through this entire project. It was definitely present on site, but what we found when we were working with our psychology collaborators was that the canine first responders were actually protected from some of the PTSD-like stress compared to first responders that weren't responding with a canine. Now, that said, there were a couple of things that also played into this. If the handler was having issues, if the handler was having concerns, the dog's behavior actually reflected that. So the dog became less trainable and more aggressive if the dog was the handler was having issues. And if a dog died within the first 3 years of 9/11, the incidence of PTSD went up in that population. And so what it really tells us is how important these dogs are, the relationship, and how connected the handlers are. We looked at the dog's behavior. There was a lot of question about whether the dogs were going to develop PTSD from this type of event. And when we looked at this using James Serple's CBARC, and these were completed annually on these dogs, both the controls and the deployed. So the deployed are here in pink, and the controls are in gray. And when we looked at the difference between these two populations in the results of their behavioral surveys, we only found 2 areas where there was a difference. And this is over time too. You can see that this is over the lifespan of the dogs, and up to about 15 to 16 years, which were the oldest dogs. And we can look at what the changes were. And the first set of panels is dog-directed fear. What you notice is that our deployed dogs had very little dog-directed fear, and it went down over time. Whereas our non-deployed dogs, with aging, those dogs tended to develop more dog-directed fear. Again, this might have been a relationship with how advanced they were in their training, how adept they were in their skills. Also, there was owner-directed aggression was higher in the non-deployed dogs. Aggression is absolutely not allowed in any of our search and rescue dogs when we're deploying at a federal level, and you can see that the level is pretty constant across our deployed dogs. What we also found were just simple aging changes where there was no difference between the deployed and the controlled. And all of these things decrease with age. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, but dogs become less trainable as they age. They have lower energy, lower excitability, and less attention seeking. So these were interesting just because this type of longitudinal study had not been conducted previously. The toxicology screen, and I mentioned we only did it in the first year, and that's because in that year, in the blood samples that we got, we actually didn't find any evidence of any of the major toxins that we were looking for. So that was a surprise given the environment that we were working in. What about long-term morbidity? We definitely know in people the 9/11 medical concerns that have been reported repeatedly. Mostly we're dealing with pulmonary problems, reactive airway disease. This was most common in responders or people who were present during the first 2 days or during the collapse itself. And so that was definitely something that has been recognized and really very, very common amongst those first responders and the survivors that have been monitored. When we look at the long-term medical components or concerns in the human responders, it's interesting. There's chronic rhinosinusitis, gastroesophageal reflux, cancer was definitely up there, asthma, sleep apnea, PTSD, lots of respiratory problems. But when we look at what we found in the dogs, it was incredibly limited, and respiratory wasn't even on the radar there. Our predominant problems that were reported over the lifetime of these dogs were musculoskeletal problems. This is common in any of our working dog populations, and that was pain, swelling, degenerative joint disease, things that we would expect, soft tissue injuries, common definitely in our working dogs, but even in our pet dogs. Skin conditions, particularly lacerations. These dogs are working and playing with full speed ahead in environments that are really kind of terrifying sometimes. And it's surprising that they have as few lacerations as they do. The other thing that we had issues were gastrointestinal issues. We have a lot of Labradors. They eat things they're not supposed to. We have a lot of German Shepherds. They have diarrhea when you look at them sideways. So these were common things that were reported by the handlers. We also reported on the surgical complaint. So did these dogs have more problems that actually required surgery? Most of the surgeries were skin surgeries. A lot of these were removing benign skin tumors. We know skin tumors are one of the most common things that we're going to see in our dogs. And so this was not unexpected. Our musculoskeletal surgeries, we had some dogs that had cruciate disease, a couple of dogs with hip issues, and then one dog with a shoulder concern. Gastrointestinal surgery, some of these dogs eat things that they should not. When we look at the cause of death or euthanasia in the dogs that responded, this is a graph showing the exposed or the deployed dogs in this kind of reddish maroon and the control or unexposed dogs in the gray. When we look at the cause of death, the number one cause of death across all of our search and rescue dogs was degenerative causes. What this is basically aging. It's osteoarthritis, it's cognitive dysfunction. These dogs were just getting older, and as a result, the handlers were choosing humane euthanasia. The second most common cause of death was neoplasia. This is very common in our dogs, regardless of whether they're search dogs or not. But we had about 33% of our dogs died of cancer or with cancer. Interestingly, there was not a difference in the incidence of cancer in the dogs that deployed to 9/11 versus those that didn't. When we look at the humans, cancer is definitely one of the concerns that we have associated with deployment to 9/11. And there were things that really struck me, and one of the ones that concerned me was lymphoma. So this was a cancer of the immune system. We know that in the environment that we were in, we were breathing in all sorts of hazards. And even though we didn't measure toxins in the blood of the dogs, we know that they were also breathing in lots of things that were potentially hazardous. In fact, the first year that we were monitoring, we saw an increase in immunoglobulins in the deployed dogs. It was only transient, but would suggest that maybe they were exposed to more antigenic or irritating things in the environment. So lymphoma was something that was of a concern. And when we look at the types of cancers that affected the dogs in our control dogs that are in the dark blue versus our deployed dogs, what you can see is that cardiovascular cancer was number one. And for anybody who knows about dogs and German Shepherds and Labradors and Golden Retrievers, one of the most common cancers that we're going to see is hemangiosarcoma. And so that was absolutely the common cardiovascular cancer that we saw across both of the groups. Interestingly, we had two types of cancer that did start to show us a difference between the dogs that were deployed versus the dogs that were not deployed. And that one of them was lymphoma. To me, this was really, I was expecting we might see a difference in lymphoma. However, what's most interesting, because lymphoma is probably one of our number 1 or number 2 most common cancers of all dogs, it was surprising we didn't have lymphoma in our control group. So that makes me think that maybe our sample wasn't representative, but nonetheless, I was kind of concerned because of the human reports of lymphoma. It didn't reach statistical significance. So it's just something that's interesting, but we really can't pursue further. But what was really interesting and really shocking and was even closer, and you can't really say that, but it was almost statistically significant, is respiratory cancer was more common in the dogs that didn't go to 9/11. And that was absolutely surprising. We were not expecting that. Respiratory cancer, lung cancer in dogs is not that common in the first place, but the fact that we saw more in our control dogs than in our deployed dogs was very much unexpected, again, given the human data. I think to me, one of the most important things that we learned was the effect of their deployment on longevity. And the effect of deployment was non-existent. The longevity of the dogs, the deployed dogs versus the control dogs, was almost identical. And to me, that was a wonderful, wonderful finding that we didn't have an impact that manifested in that way. But what was even more surprising is when we looked at the data from the AKC and other sources, and we looked at what the average lifespan of our German Shepherds, our Labradors, our Golden Retrievers, they're about 10 years as an average lifespan. And all of our dogs were living to be about 12 and a half. And to me, what that says is that being a search and rescue dog is an advantage. And there's a lot of reasons that I think that it actually can improve longevity and quality of life. I think the first thing is that they're physically active. And we know dogs that are at appropriate body weight can actually live up to 2 years longer than dogs that are overweight. We also know that these dogs had an incredible relationship, the mental stimulation, the physical activity, the kind of purpose that they had. Really, I think that is wonderful for our human-animal bond. It's wonderful for the dog. It's wonderful for the human. And I think that we were concerned that we were asking dogs to go into situations that were potentially hazardous without their consent. But what we've learned, and certainly in the 14 years at the Working Dog Center, not only are these dogs consenting, but they're begging to go into these kind of environments and do this kind of work. So this was probably our best and our most exciting information that we got out of the studies that we have done. So what it is, there's a lasting impact of this information. This work, this opportunity, my involvement with this group of dogs has completely changed my career trajectory and inspired the opening of the Penn Vet Working Dog Center. And that is the lasting impact. And it's not only an impact up to this point, but it's an impact going forward. I put on a QR code here so that if you aren't familiar with the Working Dog Center, this is going to take you to our webpage. There's lots of information and connections and videos. We also have a very active social media. We encourage people, if you're not familiar with what we do here, to seek that out and learn a little bit more, because it is an incredible opportunity. And a lot of the things that we do, and our mission is to partner with dogs to improve the health and the safety of people, animals, and the environment, a true One Health mission. And what we have, since we opened on 9/11/2012, we've had 207 dogs. 15 are in training. We've had 93 graduate to careers. They are, about a third of them are search and rescue dogs, and these are search and rescue dogs all over the United States and Canada. We have dual purpose law enforcement dogs, and then scent detection dogs in our program. And we're really proud of what these dogs do and what they contribute to science and to our knowledge, and to human, animal, and environmental health. Just a quick acknowledgement. I'm trying to keep this very short so we can have a nice conversation. And so I'd like to thank or acknowledge the AKC Canine Health Foundation, who funded so much of this work, as well as Purina, VPI, and the Companion Animal Recovery Fund, but mostly the dogs and their handlers. which were incredibly useful and helpful. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to let Lisa run with it from here. Turn off my video.
Thank you, Cindy.
All right. Cindy, you're always a hard act to follow, my friend. All right, let's make sure, Julie, if I can have an assist to make sure that I am showing that correctly. Do I need to switch or are we good?
I can see presenter notes.
Yep,
So,
hold on 1 second. Got it?
yep, that's it.
Perfect.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks for the assist. But yeah, no, hopefully this is a good segue because for me, this is also, if you came on early, you know, to some extent, this is very personal talk for me because 9/11 is actually where my direct experiences with disaster response began. So I was really, really proud to be able to follow Cindy here. And really then, you know, went on to really inform you know, where my career went, much like Cindy said, and, you know, even into what, you know, I'm working on today. So, you know, we're going to return to 9/11. The primary mission, you know, for me when I was deployed there was to do primary clinical care of the dogs that were deployed that Cindy just talked about. But if we sort of want to think about it in a slightly different way or in maybe a broader way, is when we're considering a natural or a man-made disaster, you know, what other concerns do we need to think about? So, you know, what I'm showing you is this is actually a plume image taken from that day. And so to think about not only what was going on in Lower Manhattan, but what may have also been going on and what the other impacts may have been more broadly. So just to give a few examples here, you know, is certainly with, you know, some of the debris specific issues. So when I arrived, you know, 10 days after the attack is when they were transitioning over from a rescue to a recovery operation. And so most of the debris was being moved with very large cranes and then being loaded onto barges and being moved down to the Fresh Kills landfill site that Cindy mentioned, where it was processed. And, you know, to understand that, you know, this was considered, you know, evidence from a massive crime scene. But to also understand that this landfill had previously been scheduled to close in that December. So now, you know, we're moving large quantities of potentially contaminated waste, having to think about, you know, keeping it covered, how to preserve that evidence, to try to wet it down, to minimize dusts for human and animals that were there responding, to give some thought about scavenger species that, you know, often are present at sites like that, you know, and you can really sort of start to think about, you know, lots of different issues, right? Human health, animal health, environmental health with this. Alrighty. And then the other things that happened too. So, you know, Cindy had mentioned, you know, some of the testing. And so just a little bit on some of the environmental testing that was done, you know, 3 days, you know, after the initial attack, you know, not surprisingly, runoff sampling found quite a bit of different things that Cindy's already mentioned. And then the follow-up response to that was to then look at sediment and fish as well. You know, but to also reflect on, you know, not only then the importance of doing the working animal monitoring that Cindy mentioned, also the human responder monitoring as well. I am actually among that chronic rhinosinusitis cohort, despite the use of PPE, but also maybe the broader significance and value of this testing. And when a disaster or an incident occurs, you know, that there certainly are some very immediate you know, public health and safety concerns that this kind of testing is addressing, but at this time as well as to hopefully provide, you know, some information and some reassurance. You know, we're, you know, at the time that I was there, you know, a really strong desire, you know, to do what could be done to have, you know, some sort of return, some sort of semblance of normalcy and safety and what this kind of testing, you know, is able to provide there. But when most people think of environmental disasters, I think probably the one that comes to mind is probably oil spills, right? So marine oil spills out in the ocean. You can envision the oil slicks that occur and covering broad areas, animals that have been oiled, but I just, sort of want to point out is even though some of the examples that I'm giving are, very large, they're historic, they're highly publicized, that just, close to home, there's lots of other, things that can occur and impact animals, humans, and the environment as well. So, there are different kinds of oil spills involving different hydrocarbons, all sorts of processing facilities and refineries located all across the US. Pipeline leaks, in the past, we were involved in a study actually looking at the health of pronghorn antelope that migrate across areas where there are pipelines moving hydrocarbons and other substances. Transportation accidents that happen on highways and railways every day, carrying all sorts of things. And then certainly incidents as well where waste oils and other substances are being inappropriately disposed of into the environment where they may impact both domestic and wild animals. Okay. So, I mean, certainly Deepwater Horizon, again, being probably one of the most well-known oil spills in recent memory. This was significant for the loss of human life that occurred and certainly the wide-ranging impact on animals and the environment. But I'm going to actually give another example here. Well, I think most are certainly aware of Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina is a historic storm. There's actually also an oil spill aspect here as well. I responded to this. Here's a few photos here. I actually went to Mississippi instead of Louisiana. I think the other thing that was sort of interesting just to point out to sort of the impact and the scope, whereas 9/11 was really lower Manhattan and that immediate environment. Now we have really a whole region, right? Multiple states, multiple environments that are impacted here as well. All sorts of things where they don't belong. This is actually, from one of the places that we responded. This was the Marine Life Aquarium in Gulfport, Mississippi. All right, but back to the oil spill, the aptly named Murphy oil spill that occurred with Hurricane Katrina. And so this was a facility in St. Bernard Parish in Louisiana. This was a refinery that would take crude oil to produce other types of products and then transport those off-site by barge and by pipeline. So I've already, mentioned, some of these in terms of opportunities for other types of spills. But what happened here is part of the floodwaters is the water actually lifted and dislodged a large above ground storage tank and releasing just over 1 million gallons of product and affecting a square mile of about 1,800 properties, getting into the adjacent canals. For those of you that are from this area and sort of familiar with that, can already picture, how something like this would rapidly spread. And as you can see from this photograph, some of this is very obvious residential areas. So hopefully you're already thinking about the human and companion animal impacts just in this immediate area. All right, so I'm going to show you a slightly different view here. So with the refinery on the right in the red, and as you can see again, how the contamination spread. Most of this was directly west of the facility with polyaromatic hydrocarbons most frequently involved here with this. All right. So as I mentioned, I was actually deployed to Louisiana. So this is showing some photos that I took there. So again, in terms of some other types of sampling that was done similar to some of the information that I showed for 9/11, looking at sediment, looking at soil, analyzed for different metals and organic chemicals there. And some of the results from that EPA assessment, high concentrations of arsenic. And so thinking about going into an area post-disaster, the types of activities, the potential contaminants that may have already been there, but now you have a hurricane and floodwater that's moved it around and, into different areas as well. So, with a history of herbicide use at golf courses and other types of facilities, not a surprise that arsenic was detected. Benzoyl again, multiple Superfund sites in this region. And so, something that was already a known risk and then would warrant further monitoring over time. And time is actually really important too, is just, just normally and naturally that we would expect concentrations of all sorts of these chemicals to diminish. And then the other thing that I just thought was interesting is just to mention elevated levels of lead. I mean, partially because that's something that I work with and look at now. But again, the understanding is that many of these areas were considered contaminated with excessive quantities of lead in the soil even before the hurricanes. And what was very interesting to me is after Katrina, for some of these areas, there were advisories, basically telling people not to let your children play outside in the dirt because of concerns about elevated levels of lead. Though what was interesting is there were not similar alerts or concerns about animals being in these same areas. Okay, and then to follow up some NOAA's Fishery Service testing that was done, looking at white shrimp, and again, looking at, some increases again in some polycitric aromatic hydrocarbon type compounds, persistent pollutants, but again, watching these over time, by April, had diminished to low pre-hurricane levels with that. Okay, so, where did that kind of take me from here a little bit? And, I think between my experience with the dogs at the World Trade Center and now in Hurricane Katrina, what I really became very interested in was really sort of the proactive, what could we do to protect working animals, and then if need be, what we could do for animal decontamination. So that did lead to some other interesting adventures and opportunities to consult. So this was actually a trip that I made on behalf of the U.S. Army to actually look at some new technology in terms of being able to protect working dogs out in the field. And then also with animal decontamination, I was able to bring the opportunity to do some hands-on training for potential animal responders here to New Bolton Center. So that is Dexter, the Wonder Llama. And just a word of advice, don't try to be cute and put the cute, Penn blue and red paint on the white llama if you want it off anytime soon. So these were things that I was really, interested in, wanted to work with the responders themselves to build their awareness, to make sure that they were asking the right questions, and if they encountered problems, to be able to give them some guidance in terms of, what to do and what to ask for their safety and the safety of their animals. So, then that led me to 2011. Many of you are familiar with the Fukushima disaster there. I was part of a small U.S. delegation that was asked to travel to Japan to really consult and provide some recommendations on animal issues. And so, with this, what was a little bit different is, rather than oil, rather than some of these persistent organic chemicals, now we're dealing with radiation. And this is one that, always is, sort of, very concerning and sort of extra stressful. So unlike other contaminants where, you can see them, you can smell them, you have them on you. Radiation is different. You can't really readily see or detect it without using very, very specialized equipment. So we came in, there had been some evacuation of animals, prior to our arrival, with certainly some concerns about that. But really, most residents had just been told to very quickly evacuate and weren't given a lot of information about how long they would be gone and how soon they might return. So there were many animals that had been left behind. And so, those of you that have maybe seen, or responded to disasters, and you see sort of that point, that ground zero, as it were, and then we will always draw these circles and these zones around these in terms of, conducting different activities. But again, similar to what I showed you for 9/11, that's not really how contaminants are going to move. And instead you see more of this plume. But what that is actually really telling us is that not all animals within these different zones are going to be equally at risk or equally contaminated. And what's interesting, right, is that the plume actually even leaves that zone. So, taking that into consideration when we are formulating our recommendations. And with that too, had some really, some different and distinct animal concerns to think about. So, I mean, there with companion animals, certainly the exposure of those animals as well, but, many of these would be more likely to have evacuated with their owners, and then the owners get to these evacuation shelters, many of which, would not permit their animals in. So, we're receiving photos like this with animals, in cars outside. And just to think about, after what people have been through, to think about the human-animal bond, and now to be, potentially faced with separation from their animals, as they're seeking shelter for, the rest of their family. So that was certainly an issue. What might surprise you, though, that was certainly also a concern with livestock as well, in terms of really, that strong bond, that sense of self and identity that farmers have with their animals as well. So this was right before we got there. This was a protest in downtown Tokyo, with farmers, wanting more information, about what was happening. Would they be able to, return? What was going on with their crops and their animals in that area? And then wildlife concerns as well, and certainly recognizing, the importance of wildlife under the One Health concept, that there were both, resident and migratory species involved, the difficulty of containing and sometimes, capturing and recovering and rehabilitating these animals, and then, questions about what to do about monitoring. And so I always like to put the photo of the osprey in here as well. So again, thinking back to that picture of those nice zones, animals really don't care about those zones that we draw, right? In terms of what that may mean about them moving in and out of various contaminated zones post-disaster. All right, so, we had really about a day and a half, our US delegation and our Japanese counterparts, to very quickly, identify and formulate some recommendations here. So just to briefly share these with you, what we came up with is some recommendations for rescue, decontamination, transport, and sheltering of cats and dogs, and really, companion animals in general, that was going to promote both animal welfare and safety, but also human health and safety as well, with the goal of keeping as many people and their animals together as possible. Discourage the exportation of pets out of Japan under any circumstances. This was something that also occurred with Hurricane Katrina, many animals that were moved out of the area. And again, just to think about these families, and in many cases may have lost human members of their families. And to hope that, they might at least be able to be reunited with their pet, and to do what we could to make sure that the pet had not left. And then another thing as well, and this is, certainly a hard part of being a veterinarian, but, really, thinking about that animal welfare concern, and animals that, may have been in poor health and left behind for, literally several weeks until responders could get to them, as considerations for humane euthanasia for some animals. With livestock, we did review existing protocols that were already in place with their agricultural agency. Their operations were already ongoing in terms of surveying animals within those restricted zones, just again, trying to determine if there were animals that were quote unquote clean or minimally contaminated that could be moved out. And again, making recommendations about safe and humane rescue movement, and in some cases, euthanasia following internationally recognized guidelines. And then last but not least, with wildlife, to, do what was possible to start rescue and monitoring procedures, to utilize and reinforce the capacity of a existing rehabilitation center that was located just outside of these zones. And just to really recognize the fact, right, that, wildlife can move over large areas, in terms of where the monitoring might actually need to occur beyond those recognized zones, as I've mentioned. And then last but not least, just think about now we have sort of these three different, kind of foci, these three different operations happening, and just, trying to ensure that recommendations and activities for one wouldn't necessarily be negatively impacting another. All right, so with that, I'm gonna quickly wrap up, so we'll have some time for discussion and questions. But it's kind of great to reflect on this and think about where that's sort of brought me and the people that I am privileged to work with in terms of what we're doing now. So certainly here within the toxicology lab, we do focus very much on a variety of environmental contaminants. So doing new method development, the analysis, but also the interpretation, really trying to provide some guidance in terms of what it all means, including but not limited to lead, other heavy metals and minerals. We do a lot with the impact of anticoagulant rodenticides on companion animals and wildlife, looking at PFAS and other forever chemicals, and probably most recently looking at the impact of neonicotinoid insecticides on wildlife. Personally, I certainly, participate in different consultations on incidents still as they may occur. It can be anything from unexpected mortalities, could there be, a contaminant aspect to that, suspected intentional poisonings of all sorts of animals, some consideration for the occurrence of harmful algal blooms, and other examples such as the East Palestine train derailment that happened. Alrighty, so I think with that, about where to end today, and I think maybe a message for today's audience. I think Cindy alluded to this as well, is really, what can we all do, and not just veterinarians, but other health professionals. So, if this was something that you find interesting, I mean, it certainly is important work, and just listing out some of the different ways that people involved in health professions can help, right? You can be a clinical practitioner, you can do diagnostics, you can do research, you can be involved in ongoing surveillance activities, you can be involved, with, regulations and policy around environment and agriculture, when disasters occur, epidemiology, public health, and food safety. Okay, so I think that's what I've got. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I will turn it back over to our hosts. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Cindy and Lisa.
That was great. Inspiring. So I do have, there are a number of questions here, and you should all take a look at them. I have one question that I'm hoping will combine things, but this is only one aspect that I was curious about. So I found in Cindy's the surprise about a decrease in respiratory effects, things that we predict from the human. And I wonder, Lisa, in your experience, given all the surveillance, all the understanding of toxic events, be it oil or radiation, did you see any surprises, or are there studies that look at the long-term effects on some of the companion animals or wildlife or livestock?
And there's some, and so I'm going to give you a slightly flaky but truthful answer, right? Is, whenever you have, sort of the biggest challenge of these types of things, and just I'm going to give the example of 9/11, and when Cindy and I have done different talks, all of the knowns and the unknowns, right? And if you even just consider the known contaminants that were on site there were just so many. And so whenever you put that into a real world situation, there's so many competing things, right? And sort of tracing that back to causation is really, really difficult, right? So all you can sometimes do is ask more questions and collect more data. And so some of those things that I gave at the end of my talk, some of the contaminants that we look at. So, neonicotinoid insecticides is one of the newest things that we're looking at here. Is, they've been used agriculturally and for other reasons for quite some time. Were originally, really touted as safer, better than, some of the organophosphates and carbamates, all of those things. But now we're finding, well, no, they may actually be having some negative impacts on wildlife after all, but some of them being very subtle. So rather than, the seizuring dead, kind of thing, I think what we are sort of, concerned and looking at is, Jenny, to your question, those longer term impacts on immune function, like Cindy mentioned, on reproductive health, right? And the other thing that I'm really interested in is if you even just focus on one species, what the significance is of population declines on a single species within that larger ecosystem as well. So, do we really know? Can we really trace it back to a single event, a single exposure, a single thing? A lot of times it's really, really hard. But what I hope is it doesn't frustrate us and make us stop looking and getting more information.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I want to make sure that other questions that are burning. Chris, go for it.
Thanks. That was cool. I have maybe a somewhat related question. So there's this long-standing observation that environmental exposures to an individual get encoded and can be passed down through the germline. Um, this has been observed in humans. It's been recapitulated in animal models, and we're just now beginning to understand the molecular mechanisms of this. I think they call it transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. So really, where I'm going with this is, does anybody think about this? I guess mostly in the context of companion animals and in the context of working dogs. Would it make sense to not breed animals that have had these types of exposures because of this pretty well-established biology? Sorry, I don't know who I'm asking this question
Right?
to.
I was going to say, I'm so glad that appears to be a Cindy question.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because you can't actually separate the negative effects from the positive effects. And so in our program, all our female search and rescue dogs, we keep them intact and we keep them working because we want some of the beneficial epigenetic components that might be passed down. And so most of our, the average female search and rescue dog has been spayed. Most of the males are not being used for breeding, but it's an interesting question. So we don't know the information about that. I think that there are potential hazard risks, but it's also, I think, a matter of degree, because if they're not actually having an effect, a negative effect, an adverse effect of this exposure, could they have an increased protective response that they would then pass on? So I think we have more unanswered questions than we have answers to the questions.
And those protective responses may or may not be epigenetic. Chris, it's well established in some models.
Well, it's been observed out in nature, right? Including in humans through famines in World War I or II or whatever, right?
I understand, yes.
It's been experimentally validated in tightly controlled, mouse models. And there's a fellow here at Penn Med that actually studies the mechanism of how this all works. But yeah, your point is well taken. I guess I would be concerned in a scenario where an animal is exposed to a lot of toxic gases or ingesting things that are definitely detrimental that might do some liver damage, for example. But yeah, and perhaps having lineages with some with some sort of genealogy, you could examine this if there was a known phenotype, right? Which is, I guess, part of the trick, figuring out what to track.
But I love it. I'm going to get back on my soapbox. I mean, you're just emphasizing the importance of multidisciplinary approaches, right? I mean, that's what you're talking about.
Love it. And it's a perfect segue to Julie's last question.
But did we get the questions in the chat answered at all? Like, we got some of them. I was curious about the health outcome differences between humans and dogs, and there were some other people interested in that as well.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it, Julie.
So my take on that, and this I think it's really important, especially when we're talking about One Health. We have a lot of diseases in dogs that reflect diseases in humans, and they make great models. And then there are some that don't. When we look particularly at respiratory diseases, asthma as a specific example, you can create asthma in dogs, but it takes a lot to experimentally create it. It is almost non-existent in the spontaneous population. So I think that human reactive airway disease is a major component that puts them at much higher risk. There are some differences both in anatomy and physiology, and just even the ability to filter particles. We did look at the lungs of the dogs that had died, and they did have particles at a higher concentration in the deployed dogs than in our control dogs. So we know that some of that stuff was getting in there. But the question is, are they filtering it better? Is their immune system responding differently? Because they've got some differences in their pulmonary anatomy, are they then less prone to some of these pulmonary conditions, which really was the predominant problem that we saw in our first responders? So that might be part of the difference. I always also project that dogs are different in that they don't smoke, they don't drink, and they don't worry about it. And so, humans, as a human first responder, we start thinking, it's like, oh, whenever I have a cold, it's like, oh my gosh, is this related to the 9/11 response? So we start to build that up and talk, the mind-body connection there really can kind of blow some of our human experiences into actual physical components.
That's interesting. So I'll just pose my question, but in the meantime, Casey Maynard had an interesting question in here too about cancer. Hold on, let me just pull that out real quick.
Yeah, I've got that one up, and we
Yeah.
don't know if there was a link between cancer and aggression. I think that we start getting into such small group sizes that it's really hard. The aggression that the dog showed was often, and we could definitely connect it with the human distress, human PTSD signs, and that's about the human animal bond as opposed to the physiologic effects of, if they had brain cancer. And I don't think we had many that had brain cancer. Although that's always a harder one to diagnose. There may have been some dogs that had brain cancer, but because even when we got postmortems, a lot of local vets didn't have the capacity to pull the brain out and send that in for evaluation.
Okay, thank you. And then my question is, if you could engage professionals, and this is to Lisa and Cindy, if you could engage professionals from other disciplines in your own work, which disciplines would be on your wish list, and how do you envision their contribution?
We like to play with everybody. So it's just amazing the cross, when we start talking to people in absolutely every different component. I mean, we've talked to geneticists, we talked to psychologists, we talked to neurobiologists, all of these, there's room for everybody in this discussion, and I think it's exciting. We even talked to Lisa as a toxicologist. So there's lots. I think that these programs and these concepts are so global that there is room. I don't think there's ever been a group that we have had a conversation with that we didn't go, oh, we could do this together. And that's what I think is so exciting about this program.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's always room to grow and be more inclusive and do better, right? With every, incident, with every disaster, none of them, we don't know it all, right? And every one of them is different and has its own flavor and its own challenges. So really we need all the help, all the Chris Legners that we can get. We'll take them. And so I think, like I ended with, I think Cindy and I are on the same page, as there's so much more that still, can be done. And disasters aren't going away anytime soon either. So, if there are people that want to be engaged and want to work with us on this, we welcome it.
Great. Thank you both. We do have 5 minutes left, so if anybody has a burning question that they want to ask, please feel free. Don't be shy.
I do want to just point out, Jenny, I don't know if you saw that I responded to your question. I put something in the chat that you had asked about
It looks
studies on
cool.
impacts there. Good. Okay, good. I'm great. That's one I'm familiar with. Some colleagues at the National Marine Mammal Foundation, really took the reins on that and brought in all sorts of other types of professionals. So just wanted to make sure that you and others saw that.
No, it looks great. And I was very impressed by the longitudinal studies from Cindy's work and just wondering if I know one can't control it quite as well, but yeah, it's very fascinating. Um,
Yeah, I mean, Jenny, I'll comment, with wildlife or just any of these studies in general, and some of the things is, honestly, it's just funding, right? Like to be able to look, long enough, right? You're looking for a year or looking for even 2 or 3 isn't going to be enough, and so it can sometimes be rare to have the stars align and be able to do these types of, really in-depth longitudinal studies.
Yeah, absolutely. Making what has been done with the working dogs really very interesting.
Hillary did
Impressed.
have a question in the chat about if the dogs continued to work. And yeah, most of them did. It turns out we tried to track retirement and it becomes a little bit challenging because it's usually not the dog that chooses to retire. It's often the handler. They may, decide they're done or they have other things that they want to do. So we tried to look at retirement impact. But many of these dogs did continue and some of them were down at Hurricane Katrina with us. So, they're definitely the people that do this type of work are kind of in it for the long run mostly. So
So yeah,
really is.
I'm wondering if the actual work contributes to their longevity and whether there's something about that behavior of working and how their handlers interact with them that lessons could be learned for how, pet owners can keep their pets healthier and living longer.
I love that concept. And I will say absolutely, the more we interact and engage with our animals, the better the relationship, the better the opportunity. To me, one of the biggest criminal of things that we can do for particularly our dogs, is leave them on the couch and not engage with them. So physical activity, mental activity, connection, I think that is absolutely critical for longevity, but also quality of life. Dogs are so intelligent and have such an opportunity to enhance our lives. But if we don't give them that credit and we don't engage with them, we don't do fun and interesting things with them, I think everybody misses out.
But I think that's something that the general public doesn't hear enough of. So just putting that
They're
out
not
there.
listening to me. I keep saying it.
I know, Cynthia, but you're one person. I am talking to my One Health colleagues here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's critical. It's so important on every aspect.
All right. I think that wraps up, unless anybody else has a burning question, I think that wraps it up for now. Thank you so much to both of you for your interesting talks and for being here with us today. And thank you so much for all of our participants.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.